legalizing cannabis here in this country. Obviously a hot one here in 2018. Peter Wagner from News 1130 joining us. And your perspective, quite interesting because you are a resident in Washington State. You worked for KGMI Radio for years, and you covered the inclusion of cannabis in the state when it was legalized. And there are a lot of questions surrounding it. And one of the biggest ones is, cannabis gets legalized. What does that mean for increased use by the youth? What did you see in Washington of how that came into play?
Well, the state decided to study that not long after, once they had the sort of the framework of it all in place. And what they found is that youth use didn't change after it became sort of normalized, because legalization led to normalization, obviously. So there was no increase in youth use. What they did see was that the perception of harm of marijuana had dropped among teenagers, and that perception of harm had sort of translated into youth smoking and driving within about 3 hours of smoking and then driving within about 3 hours' time. So on balance, it hasn't been a huge change for kids there, but the perception of how dangerous it is has certainly changed as they're able to see more people using it. And it's storefronts now. It's shops right down the street from them.
Well, accessibility is really interesting, and you know, you brought some visuals of what the reality is like in Washington State. When you have it this accessible, and then the challenge of impaired driving comes into play, how big of a culprit was cannabis with impaired driving, and what type of tests exist to make sure you are driving under that limit?
Well, obviously the state spent a lot of time studying how this has been impacting people on the roads, and what the state Highway Traffic Safety Commission has found is that marijuana is a huge factor in fatal and serious accidents. It's next to alcohol in terms of the kinds of drugs that people have in their system, and they're finding that a lot of people have what they call a polydrug combination, so it'll be a mix of alcohol and cannabis. But they're seeing that is a big factor in what people are taking when they're getting behind the wheel and then getting involved in these accidents. Right now, the big problem, obviously, it's not as easy as testing somebody for alcohol impairment. There's no real easy roadside test to just be able to tell, and depending on how frequently somebody ends up using, they don't show visual symptoms like somebody who has been drinking a lot and driving. There's no sort of eye nystagmus where the eye bounces back and forth. There's no very obvious smell or sort of motor impairment. So what ends up having to happen is if they suspect that kind of impairment, they have to draw blood. So it's not a roadside kind of test. They have to stop everything and take them to a hospital and draw blood. So there's a lot of groups. Washington State University out in eastern Washington has been very busily studying ways to create a breathalyzer test, but right now there's no real easy way to be able to detect for impairments. That's been a big problem for police in that state.
Well, another challenge that comes up is quality control, and Washington State was a leader with banning the home grow of marijuana. And when we look at the potential for rolling out the legalization of cannabis in Canada, this example Washington State has with the ban of home cultivation, how effective has that been, and what do you see for BC and all these provinces across Canada? Should they follow suit?
Well, I think for Washington State it was quite a lot different because they were dealing with a federal government that had no interest in legalizing marijuana. So they were trying to operate in a framework of, we have to be able to regulate and precisely control how this stuff is grown, how it's distributed, and how it's sold. And the Liquor and Cannabis Board had actually studied a while ago the governor's question of, can we allow for home growing? The Liquor and Cannabis Board had found that it's very difficult to regulate that kind of thing because it becomes very expensive. It becomes very onerous on the state to try and regulate that. You can't control access to youth. You can't regulate how people are selling it and to what standard they're kind of selling it to. But the big problem there too is that they were designing all those regulations under a Department of Justice guidance. It's called the Cole Memo, that had laid out for states, okay, these are the things we're not going to enforce with federal law, and these are the things that are going to be problematic for federal law within the state. And a lot of that was home growing. The state just has no real effective way to be able to control where it's going. So I think that will be something interesting for BC and all the provinces, is how much time and money are they willing to spend regulating home growing? Is it going to be inspectors coming to people's houses? Is it going to be self-reporting systems? So that's going to be a real regulatory hurdle in terms of how they're going to manage all of that and make sure that the quality is to the standard that the province, and in our case the state, has set.
Well, a lot of questions surrounding safety and quality control, just scratching the surface right here. Peter, thanks so much for coming by.
Thank you.
Moving up north anytime soon? Or?
Well, we'll see.
Okay.
We'll wait for those housing prices to drop a little bit.
To be continued. I appreciate you coming by. We'll take a break.